Hello everyone, this is our third class and our third unit, but this is a bigger unit than newspapers and magazines, so it's going to take us 3 classes to cover motion pictures. Television is also a big unit. It's going to take us a bunch of classes to cover television and the internet as well. Some are 1-class units and some are multi-class units, and motion pictures is one of the big ones. So when I go through this unit on motion pictures, I have some nice links to some various film clips that should be of interest to you when we talk about Bride of Frankenstein, Fred Astaire, and Citizen Kane, and so on. And the way I would be doing this in class, I've probably told you this before, but the way I'd be doing this in class is that I would put the PowerPoint slides up just like this and talk just like this, and I would go through 2 or 3 slides, and then I'd put some films on or link to them from the internet or from some of my DVDs or whatnot, and then I'd go back to the PowerPoint slides. I'd sort of go back and forth like that. And so I encourage you to do that as well. You don't have to. You're in charge. You can do whatever you want. You can listen to all the lecture and then the film clips all in a row, or pause me and take a break, or whatever you want to do. But for the classroom experience, as close to the classroom experience, that is the way I would be doing it. So you're again, you're free to do it as you choose. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the history of motion pictures in a very, very brief way. What we are going to do in 3 classes would take close to 30 classes in film history classes. Normally I have a history of motion pictures from the beginning to 1945 for a whole 15 weeks, and then history of motion pictures from 1945 to present for another 14 weeks. And we're going to do all of that in just 3 weeks. So it's going to be very, very condensed. And if you are into this stuff, then I encourage you to track down a history of motion picture class wherever you are. In the meantime, I like to talk about the beginning. A lot of people don't know about the very beginning of motion pictures, and so I like to talk about that. And some of the questions that my students ask me, when did movies have color and things like that. So I like to talk about some of that stuff, answer some questions, and lots of various clips and things like that. The way we are doing this class, whether we're talking about newspapers or magazines or whatever, but especially when we get into movies and TV and radio and so on, is there are 3 parts to it. There's the technology part, of course. We need the technology of movies and radio and the internet and so on. There's the business side, which is very important, and so I'll be talking about the business side in a lot of detail. And then there is the artistic side, and we don't want to forget about that. There are wonderful works of art in television and radio. Radio, we have War of the Worlds, things like that. Television, lots of wonderful stuff. And in the movies. So we're going to pass by it pretty quickly, but I got some pretty good film clips for you that I think highlight the artistry of motion pictures as well as illustrating various points. So anyway, Edward Muybridge took pictures to settle a bet, and what I'm going to do this because he the bet was, does a horse have all 4 of its legs off the ground in full gallop? That was the bet. That's why I took that slide off, because you can tell. So he strung a number of cameras, a bunch of cameras, at least 20 or so cameras across a track with wire or string or something like that. Not so much to trip a horse or anything, but to trip the camera shutter off. And as the horse went by in full gallop, then they would trip off the cameras, and they would get a series of pictures. And so think to yourself, does a horse with 4 legs ever have all 4 of its hooves off the ground at one time in full gallop? And so there's the answer. Yes, clearly in a couple of photos they do. Okay, and a whole bunch they don't. But in the first couple here, we see a horse does have all 4 of its hooves off the ground in full gallop. And so some people saw that, and if you remember doing flip books and things like that in school, if you take these photos and sort of flip through them, you could get the illusion of motion. And so that got a lot of people thinking. The first part of that technology, who invented motion pictures, there are 3 parts. The first one was film, and George Eastman of the Eastman Kodak company worked on film, and that was for still photography. They had tintype and things like that. Photos have been around since about 1830. Since 1830, there have been photographs and photography and all that. But the whole idea of a strip of film didn't come about until the 1890s. And a few years after he developed that film, Thomas Edison and his company, he had a lot of people working for him, but he was the ones overseeing the whole thing. And he asked, can you get me a roll of that stuff, maybe 50 feet or something like that? And so they worked on a camera where the film could go up and get exposed. There has to be a shutter in there. Film doesn't travel through a camera constantly the way audio tape does. It has to stop briefly, and that's why film needs a shutter, and there's a loop, and all sorts of other stuff. But anyway, they figured that out, and the cameras were hand cranked. There's the hand crank. This would be probably for panning, and this would be for tilting. And so they worked on that, but after Edison was done, people that were going to watch movies watched them one at a time. There was a box, and you would put your eyes up to the box. They called it a peep show. And you would put your nickel in, and you could crank it, and you could see a 30-second clip of film. And we've had other, they call them magic lanterns, sort of projections and things, almost like a slideshow. And they had been around for a while, for actually hundreds of years. And people have been watching actors and so on for thousands of years. Going back to the Greeks for sure, that's at least 2,500 years ago. And it seemed like a natural for these little moving pictures, okay, movies, right, moving pictures, to be maybe projected in front of an audience rather than for people to see them one at a time. And so the French came up with the solution to that, projectors. Then the Lumiere brothers worked on that. So it really took these 3 separate pieces of technology to give us motion pictures. So 1890s, that's the key right there. 1890s is when movies became movies. About 1895, right in the middle of the decade, there were motion pictures in front of audiences. The next question that a number of students ask is about color in the movies, color and sound, so we got to talk about those. Color, the earliest films were colored, but they were colored by hand. So this is from 1902. It is a film in color. I know that's not the kind of color you're thinking of. You're thinking of a more realistic sort of color, and that didn't happen for a while, till the 1930s or so. But films have almost always been in color, technically speaking. And other times, films would be bathed in a color so that if a scene took place at night, it would have a blue tint to that scene. The whole scene, everything would have a blue tint to it. You've probably seen those before. If it was out in a hot desert, there would be sort of a yellow tint to it. Maybe in the jungle, there would be green. And sometimes things would be sepia. And then there's the regular old black and white and grayscale. It's not really black and white, but the grayscale. But there were color movies way back in 1902. And the French, he was a magician to start off with, Georges Méliès, and he is really the father of special effects, and I have linked to his A Trip to the Moon, and it is hand-colored and it's about 12 minutes long, and it's a lot of fun. I remember seeing it on, I think it was Netflix. I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix, but anyway, I've linked to it, and you can check it out. It's really kind of fun. 1907 to 1910, they moved to Southern California. And I guess I should say, where did they move from? Well, they moved in the United States. Basically, they moved from New York and New Jersey, and that's where the first movies were being shot and made. New Jersey had countryside and forests and things like that, so just across the river from New York, and they could take those early cameras over there and make their little stories, westerns, things like that, just 10 or 20 minutes long. But they were very popular. Lots and lots of people wanted to see these moving pictures. They really appealed to immigrants who couldn't speak English. They could see these little moving pictures. The middle class people at the time would often be going to maybe the theater or music halls and things like that. That might cost a little bit more money, but these little Nickelodeons for just a nickel, and you didn't even have to speak English, and so they were pretty popular among the lower classes to start off with. And they were so popular that they needed to crank them out pretty much all year round. And it was kind of hard to shoot indoors. Back then, 1900, they needed a lot of light. And so you either needed to shoot in front of a lot of windows or you needed to go outside. And that just really was restrictive. And especially remember, New York and New Jersey have winter, snow, cold, sleet, rain, all that kind of stuff. Gray, very short days. So in order to crank these movies out all year round, the people that were paying for the movies and things, these little entrepreneurs and so on, they sent teams out to Southern California. And Southern California had the sunshine and the warmth, and it also had mountains and a desert and an ocean and all sorts of stuff. So it was a really great place to make these moving pictures. So they visited for a few winters, and then eventually people settled. They shot on the streets for a while, and then very quickly they bought land and property and put up buildings and things like that, and they would have studios. These short little films were very popular, and at first nobody knew who the actors were, but by about 1913 or so, some of the actors got fan mail and things like that, and so people like Mary Pickford and Fatty Arbuckle and Mabel Normand started getting known, and Charlie Chaplin is our example of the movie star. And really a big, huge movie star, probably the most known person on the planet for a while, through the teens and 20s for sure, probably into the 30s. And I'm betting that most of you know Charlie Chaplin. There are lots of big movie stars like Clark Gable and Jean Harlow and Jimmy Cagney, and you might not know who they are. And they were very, very big stars. Every bit as big as Leonardo or Brad or any of those big stars, and you probably don't know who they are, and that's not really on you. That's just how fast stardom fades, right? People can be very, very famous, but to be famous 100 years later is pretty rare. Even most presidents, other than Lincoln and Washington and Jefferson and so on, aren't famous 100 years after they are gone. But Charlie Chaplin, there's a few, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, people like that probably most of you know who they are. And so there's Charlie Chaplin, and he was called the Little Tramp. And what I find really astounding about Charlie Chaplin is basically he's playing a homeless guy. He's a homeless guy. Nothing fits. I mean, it's funny that nothing fits, but it's funny nothing fits because he found it in the trash. That's the implication anyway, is he found it in the trash. And in a lot of those movies, he's sleeping in a box or an abandoned place or something like that. He's often on the run from the police and so on. His pants are way too baggy, shoes are too big. but he has aspirations. Okay, he has a tie and a vest and a hat and a cane and all that. Okay, so he wants to look like a gentleman, even though these are all basically found in the trash. And I just find that so amazing that the most famous person on the planet was portraying a homeless guy, a little tramp. So there's Chaplin. He was English, by the way. He was discovered over here touring the country in an act. He would play old men and drunks and all sorts of stuff like that. Very, very funny, a real genius. And I have linked to The Circus from 1925, one of his feature films. And I've got, I think it's the whole film, but normally I would show about the first 10 minutes or so. And I've also linked to a famous bit that he did, the Dance of the Rolls, that is a work of art in miniature. So you can check out some Chaplin. He holds up pretty well 100 years later. So if you've got any little brothers or sisters or cousins, you might bring them in and check it out. Chaplin, a real genius. There were 3 of these geniuses in the silent era. Harold Lloyd. I don't think I spelled Harold right. It would be Harold. Anyway, he did some thrill films, Safety Last, things like that. Maybe you've seen that picture. That's a lot of fun. And the third, and really fantastic, is Buster Keaton. He played the great Stoneface. Dry humor, elaborate physical stunts, and I've linked to a bit on YouTube talking, sort of analyzing Keaton's humor, and it's a lot of fun. I think you might enjoy that too. So those are the 3. That's the stuff that really lasted the best. Some of the dramas seem a little overdone, and some dramas, they have so many title cards. Back then, they would put a black screen with white words on it, white text. They didn't do subtitles where you would see the words that they were speaking below their picture. Those would be subtitles. But they would do intertitles. And it really, to me, it kind of slows down the movie. I know you need to advance the plot and you need to have people talking and so on. But it's really a visual medium, and people like Keaton and Chaplin, they actually competed with each other to use the fewest title cards. And that's why I think their stuff is so fantastic. And some of the drama is beautiful. It's really beautiful. There's some great stuff out there, but sometimes, depending on the director, there are a lot of title cards and things. And the stuff that I think holds up for today's audiences, meaning you, I think is the comedy. The comedy holds up quite well. The studio system starts to take hold in the 1920s. It is mass production, and we've been talking about mass production all semester. We've talked about the penny press and how they could do mass production of newspapers, which drives the cost down. Stuff, it gets to be cheaper when you crank it out in large quantities and very fast. We're going to talk about that when we get into television and radio and the recording industry and computers and all that, right? A lot of this technology is very expensive when it first comes out for a lot of people, until a few well-off people buy it, and eventually the costs go down. And so for movies, the mass production of movies could get the cost down, and large audiences and all that sort of thing. And people could go to the movies for a nickel or a dime or a quarter or something like that. So that is the studio system. The studio lots had huge stages for indoor sets. They had generic streets, a big city street and a small town street and a western street. Westerns were very popular in sort of a European brick street. And they would save all that stuff, right? They would save these costumes and things, right? Of course, the lights and the cameras, but they could save all that stuff. They didn't have to recreate the wheel every time they made a movie. They had all their props and interiors, and all of that. And so they would just go into the prop room and get their costumes and get their stuff and put the sets together and rearrange it, and off they went again. So the cost of movies went down. These are some of the original studio moguls. Don't worry about naming them all off. Do not worry. I'm certainly not going to ask you all of their names. But importantly, they were immigrants, and they came from Eastern Europe. You know, America had wave after wave of immigrants coming over. The first, you know, the English and the Scottish and so on, and then French and German and so on and so on, and Irish, and then about the turn of the last century, somewhere around 1900, more people came from Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, places like that, and Italy, Southern Europe. So these men, they're all men, were mostly from Eastern Europe, and they were Jewish. That is a minority religion, and it is hard being a minority. I don't think I need to tell you that, but it is a rough road being a minority, and so they certainly were, but they were not able to get into banking and some of the established industries, but motion pictures were brand new, and there was no old guard there keeping them out, so they could get into the motion picture industry. It was brand new, and become moguls. Moguls, yes. And there they are from the studio. Again, don't worry about you know, all their names and everything, but there they are, this bunch of immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants. My mother's parents were immigrants to this country from Eastern Europe. Sadly, they didn't become movie moguls. They're from Czechoslovakia, but we all have immigrant stock, and so something to be proud of, I think. Some of the studios owned theater chains, and that is called vertical integration, and there it is in italics, so that means it's going to be important in one way or another, and that means that they made the movies, and they put their movies in their theaters. Now, the courts are eventually going to rule against that, but not until almost the end of the 1940s are they going to rule against vertical integration. But for the most part, you know, automobile manufacturers don't get to sell the cars. You have to go to a dealer, and that's a separate company. So eventually, like I say, the courts are going to rule against that. But vertical integration, very important. The studios built picture palaces, and they wanted to raise the prices, right? They wanted to charge more than a nickel, and people aren't going to spend more than a nickel if the movie's only 10 minutes long and you're sitting in a folding chair. So they built these beautiful palaces, and this is the famous Chinese theater in Hollywood, and a man named Sid Grauman built these, and he built the Chinese and the Egyptian and a few others. And in the courtyard, right up in here in the courtyard, this is actually an extra credit thing that you can do. I might have already talked about this, I can't remember, but here it is again. And in the courtyard, there are these slabs of cement. This is Humphrey Bogart, a big, big movie star, and you probably don't know who he is because it was 60 or 70 years ago. But you know Charlie Chaplin. So it really shows how famous Chaplin was, I think. And so he's writing to Sid, okay, Sid Grauman, and he was a tough guy. He acted in film noir, thus the Till I Kill You. But if you go up there to the, you will see the Walk of Fame, right? The stars and the walk that goes on for a while. You get to see the cement slabs and all that. And you can still go up there. It's not closed. Yes, I know that a lot of things are closed down, but when things settle down, you know, Hollywood's still open and drive-ins are still open, so you can do those if you want for extra credit. And this is the inside of the Chinese theater. It really is a palace. It's wonderful, and people, you don't mind spending a little extra money, right? You don't mind spending a little bit of extra money in a place like this. This is across the way there, the Egyptian theater. And the El Capitan is right directly across the way. That is owned by the Disney company, so they will play any Disney or Marvel or Lucas or Pixar film that they have in general release. There's the inside of the El Capitan. Fun thing to do when when movie theaters are open and all that. It's really fun, but you don't need to go inside the theaters to get the extra credit for the Hollywood experience, as I call it. Also in Hollywood is the Hollywood Land sign. That seems kind of weird to see that land on there. It began as a real estate development, and they were just selling houses up in there. They had some sample houses in Hollywood Land, and it kind of became a symbol. And by 1945, land had come down, and we have probably the most famous sign in the world, I would say. And in 1927, we have the first Academy Awards, known as the Oscars. Okay, so that's been going on since 1927. Movies are like 30 years old by then, but they began in 1927. They hit 90, what are they up to? 93, I guess, at this point, something like that. 1927, we also get the sound era, and we have the first talkie. Okay, talkies, movies that talk are talkies. Pictures that move are movies, movies that talk are talkies. Pictures of yourself are selfies. Yes, that's been around for a while. This is The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson. So if you see a movie with the lips and the words synced, then it means it came out since 1927, not before 1927. Okay, so there's one way. There's, if you see a talkie after 1927, and color movies are probably after the 1930s and so on. The Jazz Singer was a big hit. It seems kind of clunky. You can see clips of it online, but it was a huge hit. People just loved the whole talking thing. And so talkies became about 100% of movies had, I call it sync sound, because there were orchestras and lots of other sound in movie theaters all that time. You didn't just watch a movie silently. There would be music. Sometimes a whole orchestra, if you were at the Chinese theater, some nice big theater. Other times it might be just a piano or an organ or something like that. Sometimes they would do sound effects even, maybe horses or gunshots or something like that. So even in the 1920s, there was a fair amount of sound, but the whole talking, sync sound, that was 1927. The other technology, and this is a little bit different. Remember, I told you sound takes about 3 years. By 1930, most American movies are sync sound. Color takes about quite a bit longer. So 1902, we have hand coloring. And this is frame by frame. And back then, they were cranking the cameras about 16 to 18 frames per second. They settled on 24. But that's still a lot of hand coloring, frame by frame. And 35 millimeters is only about 2.5 inches wide. So it's pretty tiny, and there's a lot. So they didn't do a lot of it, but there are hand-colored movies out there. A little easier to do is the bath process. This is a wonderful film called Metropolis with the robots and flying cars and all sorts of cool stuff from 1927. I think it's from 1927. Anyway, all blue or all. Sometimes I've seen war movies tinted red. More likely, you're going to see desert scenes. They would do it scene by scene. So if the scene took place at night, then that 5 or 10 minutes of the movie would be tinted blue, and then if there was a different scene that took place in the heat or the desert or something, then that would be tinted yellow or back to grayscale. Also in the 1920s, we get 2-strip color process. Okay, so this is 2 strips of color, but still color movies in the 1920s. And then finally in the 1930s, 1933, we have Technicolor, and this is the realistic 3-strip color process. If anybody should ask you when movies had a realistic color process, you would answer the 1930s. This is from Gone with the Wind from 1939. Beautiful Technicolor film. Now, Technicolor was kind of a big deal, so and audiences weren't clamoring for it. Like I mentioned earlier, sound took about 3 years to come in. Color takes about 35 years to come in, from 1933 to 1968. It's not till about toward the end of the 60s before virtually all American movies are in color. Beatles' Hard Day's Night's black and white. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove is in black and white. Walt Disney's The Absent-Minded Professor is in black and white. Those are all 1960s movies. So people didn't seem to mind. They didn't seem to mind. And one of the things I mentioned to my students is, because I know a lot of my students have never seen a black and white movie, and so I mentioned 3D movies with the 3D glasses. And they have been around for a while now. They've been around for 10 years. And we don't seem to mind. We don't seem to care. Most of my students, when I ask, don't really care to see 3D movies. And imagine 60 years from now when people say, hey, Grandma, Grandpa, how could you watch those flat movies back in the 2020s? And you're going to say it was no big deal. Movies looked fine. Okay, so that's kind of the way people were with color. It's like, how could you watch all those black and white movies way back when? And people say, no big deal. It's okay. We didn't mind. Just like you don't mind not seeing 3D movies, I guess. Maybe that's a good analogy. Anyway, they're a lot of trouble. These cameras were gigantic. Look at that camera. It's huge. You got to put it on wheels, all that kind of stuff. It really is a big deal, people pushing it around and all that. And inside the camera, look at that. 3 strips of film. There's a prism in there, and red, green, and blue, and all that kind of stuff. So it was a big deal. Processing it, getting the camera working right. It needed a lot more light than black and white did. So they had to have, big, giant, bright lights, lots of big lights, okay, and so on. And these poor actors, maybe the Wizard of Oz and so on, and all those costumes and stuff, they were really roasting. Gone with the Wind with those Civil War costumes and petticoats and whatever and all that kind of stuff. The poor actors would really be frying and sweltering under all of that because they needed just a lot of light. It really almost sun bright. The lights need to be almost as bright as the sun in order to activate the chemicals. Remember, it's a photochemical process, so there are chemicals on the celluloid, laid right on top of the celluloid. It's a photochemical process, and the light from the sun or from the lights activates the chemicals, and the lens focuses it and all that kind of stuff. So they could not shoot in low light, that's for sure. They needed lots and lots of light, and then they had to start thinking about costumes and make sure that what people were wearing matched the backgrounds and things and didn't clash in any way, and the makeup on the faces and everything had to go on a certain way. So it was kind of a big deal. It really was a big deal. And again, it's not until the end of the 60s before films are all the way in color. I'm not going to ask you all these dates and everything. Don't worry about that. I might say, how long did it take? And you're going to answer 35 years. But other than that, don't worry about the individual bits of that. There is a blue screen process way back in the 50s, though. 12 steps. So that was kind of a big deal. Disney did some of that stuff with Mary Poppins and things like that. 1934 is the production code, and it's also called the Hays Code because the man who ran the office was named Will Hays, and it had been around for a while, but it wasn't enforced very well until 1934. And so before 1934, they call that PreCode, and I have linked to Tarzan and His Mate, an adventure film, Tarzan and Jane, which is sort of like an Indiana Jones type movie, but it's pretty darn racy, and I've linked to that. There's a nude underwater scene that goes on for quite a while, like 5 minutes. And I love this. This is staged by some probably at night or on the weekend studio people, and they are breaking all the rules, right? The law is defeated, inside of the thigh, lace lingerie, I don't know why lace lingerie, a dead man, narcotics, I think there's a needle right there, yes, narcotics, drinking, so yeah, there's the bottle, exposed bosom, I guess that's exposed bosom, gambling, there's cards, there we go, there are the cards, pointing a gun, yeah, pointing a gun, and a Tommy gun, a Thompson submachine gun. So anyway, somebody put that together, sort of poking back at the Hayes office. I don't know if anybody knows who did it, but it's kind of a famous photograph, and it's kind of funny. So movies changed quite a bit from then on. It was put in, very importantly, by the studios themselves. Now, there was a lot of clamor for the government or states, churches. There was lots of clamor for this. Movies were just getting a little too racy for a lot of people's tastes, showing scenes like this, really, kind of racy, really. And so Hollywood, before the government could step in, or the churches or the states or the cities or whatever, they self-censored. Okay, self-censorship. That's the key right there, self-censorship. And they did that. So this is the PreCode. There's the PreCode era. Mostly from Talkies, I guess that's why. Technically, everything before 34 is the PreCode era. But anyway, 28 to 34, some fun films in there. And that was in for exactly 34 years. And then in 1968, we get the age-based rating system. We still have that today with R and PG-13 and all of that. They made changes through the years. I don't go through all the changes, but they didn't start with NC-17 and PG-13 or any of that. But that's where we ended up. And yeah, there's Tarzan and his mate. Nude underwater swim scene. You can see it on YouTube there. And I picked on poor Tarzan and Jane because it makes the point pretty well, I guess. There's lots of other films, like this one, really like this one, that make the point. Here's Tarzan and Jane. Jane's outfit's pretty revealing here, showing lots of skin and whatnot. And beautiful photography, by the way. They had some staff photographers. I think that's Harrell that did those. Beautiful lighting, beautiful photography. But anyway, after the code started being strictly enforced, we have Jane sort of in a mini dress as opposed to this little swimsuit. And it even extends as far as cartoons. There's Betty Boop, so based on a 1920s, like a party girl. They called them flappers, I think, because of the way they were dancing and so on. And that is her garter belt there. That's her garter belt. Some of you ladies might be aware of those from weddings and things like that before pantyhose and all that came in. And the point is that her dress is so short that it's showing her support garment. Okay, so that's her garter belt. I guess it would be like showing a bra strap or something today. So that was kind of a little bit of a racy cartoon. Even Betty had to tone it down. Her dresses came down to her knees and all that. Some more art. I think Chaplin is very definitely art, and even some of the Tarzan stuff is rather artistic. But Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, there they are. Top Hat is our example. The Depression hit pretty hard from 1929, October of 1929. A lot of people were out of work for a long time, from 1929 to 1937 or so, depending on where you... So that's a long time. Nothing has come up to that. 8 years is a long time for massive unemployment. And Hollywood responded with escapism, and that is one of the things, if you want to know what's going on, you can watch TV or back then read the newspaper or the radio or whatever, but movies were mostly about escape. Now, they had a few movies that talked about the Depression a little bit, Wild Boys of the Road and things like that. There were a few, but for the most part, you could go off with Fred and Ginger and elegant surroundings, tuxedos and beautiful designer gowns, resorts and hotels and airplanes even, and luxury yachts, all that very luxurious stuff. It must have seemed very foreign to people that could barely scrape together a quarter to go to the movies. So Hollywood's always been pretty good with escapism, even going off to other worlds and other planets and things like that. Hollywood, I would say, specializes in escapism. And so I've linked to a A Wonderful Dance from Top Hat from 1935. Genres. Hollywood discovers genres, especially in the 1930s. We get musicals, we get horror, we get westerns, we get all of that. This is Singin' in the Rain, a wonderful movie with Fred Astaire. So this is part of marketing, really. People, you don't just want to buy a movie like buying a pair of shoes. What kind of shoes do you want to buy? You want to buy running shoes or tennis shoes or formal or high heels, or, you know, the movie isn't enough, just like shoes aren't enough. So genres help to describe what kind of a movie people are going to see. And if people like musicals, and this is a musical, then you'll probably like it, even if you don't know much about it. And the same thing goes with westerns. There's Monument Valley, John Wayne, a wonderful film called The Searchers, in color, from the 1950s. We get tropes. We get musical tropes, western tropes, shootouts, saloons, posses, Indian attacks, Monument Valley, all that kind of stuff. Horrors, we get horror tropes, castles and fog and thunder and lightning and mad scientists and monsters and creating life and playing God, and all that kind of stuff. I think that's Dracula's castle there from 1931. So these wonderful genre films, three really famous ones. And I've linked to Bride of Frankenstein for a little fun. Frankenstein, the first movie, Frankenstein, in 1931. Bride came out in 1935. I just mentioned, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you how old she is, but Mary Shelley wrote this book when she was only 19. That's just amazing. 202 years ago. And there is the monster. Okay, that's the monster. Frankenstein is the doctor, by the way. Frankenstein's the doctor, Dr. Frankenstein. And that is the monster, as he's called in the credits, Boris Karloff. And there's the bride. And wonderful labs and thunder and lightning and lighting. The lighting is wonderful, coming from down below, all that. So I have linked to a wonderful scene from Bride of Frankenstein. And just some food for thought. Again, don't worry. I know students are always asking me, is this going to be on the test? And the answer is no, this is not going to be on the test. But I'd like you to ponder a little bit, some thought, creating life in a lab. And we still have something like that today, only most of the life people create in labs today would be artificial. They would be robots or cyborgs or replicants or androids, whatever you want to call them. But basically, they are Frankenstein movies. Edward Scissorhands, Ex Machina, Blade Runner 2049, Westworld, all that stuff. So it's just a little bit of a thought. And sci-fi loves this stuff. We'll talk about sci-fi when we get into the Blacklist era, by the way, I think. So do these beings have a soul? Can they be killed? Are they murdered? Are they scientists playing God? Are they slaves? And sci-fi loves to ponder these philosophical questions. And maybe you're a sci-fi fan, maybe not. But sometimes you can tell a story about the present with a little allegory from setting your story in the future. Here we have a scene from Blade Runner. There's Rachel. Just food for thought. Okay, so 1939 is Hollywood's golden year. These two movies came out in 1939. Surrounding 1939 is really the golden age, Renaissance, and that year. A lot of people settle on 1939 for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why, but people have settled on 1939 being this golden year. These two movies came out, and a bunch of others that you probably don't know, like Destry Rides Again and Ninotchka and Gunga Din. But a lot of great movies came out in 39, and it was a real peak for Hollywood and for movies. The second peak, and I mention this because the second peak is going to be in the late 60s and early 70s. And that's The Godfather and Chinatown and The Exorcist and lots of movies that came out in that period. So this is the first golden age, and we'll talk about the second golden age in a class or two. Also, when we watch these old movies, we are going to see all sorts of weird prices. Look at that, a hamburger for 15 cents and a cheeseburger for 19 cents. But in about 1940 or 1950, I held steady for a while, a good middle-class job like a school teacher would be maybe $1,000 a year. Okay, $1,000 a year. And so you might see people buying $5,000 houses and $500 cars and things like that. But if you're only making money $1,000 a year, yeah, all those prices seem maybe kind of steep. And so when we watch some of these old movies, you know, like they say, a dollar doesn't buy what it used to buy. So you could get a full meal and plop down a dollar bill and get change back, right? Hamburger, cheeseburger, 19 cents. French fries for 10 cents. That's 29 cents. You could get a root beer or a shake for another 15 cents. They're 50 cents. You could buy a whole meal for, you know, a little more than 50 cents back then. So that is inflation, and generally people, you can adjust for inflation. So when somebody says that such and such a movie is breaking the record, whether it's Avengers or Avatar or something like that, or Titanic, once you adjust for inflation, then generally older movies have the records. And so Gone with the Wind, once we adjust for inflation, has made the most money of all time. 3.3 billion. And those other movies that I mentioned, like Avatar and Avengers and so on, they're not even in the top 20. Most of you get older movies like some early James Bond movies. You get Sound of Music, things like that. And Star Wars from 1977. So Star Wars is, I think, number 2 in a lot of those lists, but there has been a fair amount of inflation in over 40 years. Okay, so lots of great movies I've been talking about, Gone with the Wind, and Charlie Chaplin, and all that kind of stuff, and even Bride of Frankenstein. And so we would ask ourselves, what makes a great movie? What is a great movie? So Citizen Kane from 1941 is often held up to be the greatest film of all time, and I've linked to a couple of scenes from Citizen Kane. One of them is his childhood, and we're going to see one continuous take, and the camera's going to track all the way across the room, and we're going to see Charlie way there in the background, and his parents signing some documents and so on. That's deep focus, right? So stuff near the camera and stuff very far away from the camera is all in focus together, and the ceiling is there, and that's where a lot of people would put lights and microphones, but Wells put a ceiling. Okay, so they broke a lot of rules. I don't want to get too deep into Citizen Kane. I would have to talk to you for 30 minutes or so to go through Citizen Kane. But it is an amazing movie, and by a lot of accounts, the very best film. So that brings us to the question, and side point, Wells came from radio and the theater, and he was famous for directing War of the Worlds for radio, and we will listen to War of the Worlds when we get to our radio unit in a few weeks. So we're kind of reversing that, but there he is at CBS Studios directing from the floor. He would do voices and do directing and all that. Anyway, he was famous for War of the Worlds, and then he went to Hollywood and made this wonderful movie. So how do we know greatness in the arts? Whether it's Rembrandt or Picasso or Beethoven or the Beatles. Okay, how do we know what's great? And this is from Citizen Kane, by the way. There's his castle there. And we get a general agreement of experts. Okay, so and I put in there experts because experts are going to see things that others aren't going to see. And if we think about the Olympics, they have judges, okay, whether it's snowboarding or figure skating or gymnastics. There are experts that are going to see things that the rest of us aren't going to see. And that holds true for the arts as well. Experts are going to hear different things in Beethoven or the Beatles and see different things with Picasso or Rembrandt or the movies. So we have a general agreement of experts. Let's shorten that to consensus. And our second criteria is, does it stand the test of time? And Citizen Kane, yes, from 1941, all those years ago, it really does stand the test of time. It really does. Other than being in black and white, which maybe turns a few people off, it really does stand the test of time. Gone with the Wind gets a little bit icky, let's say, dealing with race and race relations and even male-female relations and things like that. But Citizen Kane, it really still holds up pretty well. And we are going to shorten that to perspective, right? We've got to stand back and look at the big picture. And once we do that with Citizen Kane, it looks pretty darn good. And that works for most good movies, whether it's 2001 or The Graduate or The Godfather or Casablanca, right? Consensus and perspective work pretty well. So there's some deep focus cinematography. I just thought I'd throw that in, very close to the camera, very far back, all in focus, ceilings, all that sort of thing. I'm not going to ask about deep focus cinematography, but there's a nice example of it. Don't want to get too much into the weeds. Thinly veiled story of William Randolph Hearst, and we've already talked about William Randolph Hearst with newspapers just a couple classes ago. It was fairly controversial. Very low angles, right? They even had to cut into the studio floor in order to get certain angles there. There he is in makeup with his cinematographer, director of photography there, Greg Tolan. Okay, and so also in the 1930s and 40s, we get double features. And the A movie with big stars like Humphrey Bogart would play first and had bigger stars and bigger budgets. And then the second movie on the bill would be the B movie. Here's a wonderful B movie. It's a great movie, but it was low budget and cheap, and the stars were not big stars. And so B movies sort of took on a new term, right? People started talking about just low budget movies in general as B movies. Later, in the 1950s, B movies sort of morph into drive-in movies. I love these. Island of the Doom, Castle of Blood, wonderful stuff at one of our local drive-ins. Drive-ins have kind of faded away. There's still enough around. Maybe a few hundred are still around. And in Southern California, we can go to drive-ins all year round. But people don't talk about drive-in movies so much anymore. Mostly, I read or hear people talking about B movies again. Sometimes direct-to-video, things like that. But you still might hear that term B movies. Okay, so that gets us all the way up about a third of the way to the early 1940s. And I have linked to the trailer for Gone with the Wind and a couple of clips from Citizen Kane and Fred and Ginger dancing and Tarzan and his mates swimming, Buster Keaton making us laugh, and Chaplin, and Trip to the Moon. So have a little bit of fun with those links. And in our next class, we will pick it up from there. We've got Alfred Hitchcock and the French New Wave and some more wonderful stuff in our next class. And for now, Dave Eccles signing off. And thank you so much for joining me. And until next time, take care.